Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist with another edition of Friends and Enemies. I'm in the United States. My co-host is Alex Benesch. He is in Germany. We're going to be discussing in more detail this concept of fascism, how it relates, how Russia uses it, how the left uses it, how people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez use it, and how it plays and fits in, and how there's an attempt to insinuate fascism in all kinds of groups. They've called conservatives, middle-of-the-road people fascists. I mean, the communist bloc would do that. They've called the Zelensky regime, what is it, Nazi, Alex? They've tried to say that there are Nazis in Kiev. The war can't end until the Nazis are pushed out of power, and yet the president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, is Jewish. These kind of things. I mean, everybody, even a Jew, can be a fascist or a National Socialist and a Nazi now. And of course, talk about how this fits in with what Alexander Dugin has been doing, going back to the conspiracy stuff, and of course, the war mobilization of Russia currently, and what's happening in Europe. So, Alex, why don't you tell us what you have on that?
Okay, so at some point, communists in the West, they need a new branding, right? They had to feel somewhat fresh, and so kind of like a marketing department makeover. So they reuse that term Antifa, meaning anti-fascist action, right? This became kind of the new branding, and right after World War II, there was kind of a marketing problem for the extreme left, because fascism was done. It was over. The Nazis were done. The Italians were done, over. So it's kind of hard to mobilize the masses and get them to do illegal things. Just taking part in violence and secret operations, join a communist cell or whatever, or even just provide cover addresses, provide vehicles to active communist extremists and terrorists, or store items for communist networks. You can give me a package and I'll put it in my garage. I don't look into the package, and there's weapons and explosives in them, and blah blah blah. So fascism was done, but the marketing then said something completely different. They said, part of fascism was over, but the bigger fascist imperialist pig conspiracy problem, the bigger conspiracy is still there. So we still have to actively fight it, and there is a looming open fascist dictatorship. So at some point, it's not going to be this bourgeois, fake democracy, fake republic thing. At some point, it's going to be open fascism. This became the central drumbeat of the marketing, and so it was to push that marketing even further. The communists needed instances, a lot of little instances that could be construed as a huge fascist threat. And it wasn't just about, a corporation doing evil things, or corporations being very close to politicians, and a country like the U.S. Going to war, against some communist invading force somewhere in the world. This was not enough for the marketing. No. They needed the belief, they needed the conviction that the masses, or a sizable portion of a given population, that these common people were fascist-minded, and that they would join an open fascist dictatorship, that there were millions and millions of possible Hitlers out there, and possible Hermann Görings out there. Because the Nazis or the top Nazi leadership came from humble backgrounds or normal backgrounds. So this was the paranoia in the marketing. Proto-fascists or quasi-fascists everywhere. And this needed many little instances of seeming proof of this mass conspiracy, right? So this was in the form of anti-Semitic writings. This was in the form of anti-Semitic or Nazi graffiti being sprayed on Jewish cemeteries or Jewish synagogues in the middle of the night. This would be attacks against Jewish people, individuals here and there. This would be all these sorts of things. You know, some Nazis running around doing things, maybe a bombing here, bombing there. It needed to create this impression that there was this mass conspiracy going on, and that no left person could relax mentally and physically. You know, it was you as part of the rebellion, like in a Star Wars movie. And actually, George Lucas was pretty communist, actually. You needed to feel like you're part of the rebellion against this evil empire, like with Darth Vader and this Star Wars empire. And so you're in this multicultural group, and your heritage is what the previous generation did, you know, physically fighting the Nazis, or even before World War II, trying terrorism against the Nazis, or even the previous governments, you know, trying to prevent fascism, you know, terrorism attacks, and organizing with the Soviet Union, that sort of thing. So you needed to be part of this movement. And it's interesting to see that anti-Semitism, classic traditional conspiracy mythology, that really played into the hands of the Kremlin a lot. This is what helped the Kremlin just mobilize all these hordes of communist Antifa activists all over the world, especially recruiting young people. But at the same time, the Kremlin, you know, unbeknownst to many communists, the Kremlin was getting pretty anti-Semitic. I am sitting in front of a digital copy of Pacepa's book Disinformation, one of the biggest or most highest ranking, formerly I think even the highest ranking Soviet defector. I think he's called Mike. For, you know, he's people that know him call him Mike.
Yeah, he would. I corresponded with him.
It's Ion Mikhail, but they call him Mike Pacepa.
Yeah, that's what he would go by. Yes.
Right, and so he was very, very high ranking. He defected, and he has this to say in his book. He says, in 1960, when I returned from Germany, there was a strong anti-Semitic attitude both in the Kremlin and at the top of the KGB's intelligence community. Jews were being removed from the KGB. The Romanian DIE, intelligence agency, and its mother organization, the Securitate, were also in the process of quietly removing them. Khrushchev loathed Jews even more than Stalin did. Quote, "It's in my blood, my serf's blood," I heard Khrushchev say during his 6-day vacation in Romania. On that occasion, Romanian ruler Gheorghe Dei informed Khrushchev that the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service was prepared to pay Bucharest secretly in dollars for each Jew that would be allowed to emigrate. As far as Day knew, that was a first in the Soviet blog, and he did not have the courage to approve such a delicate operation all by himself. Initially, Khrushchev exploded in a deluge of invectives against the swindler Zhidani usurers who believed they could buy us the way they bought America. Zhidan was the worst Romanian pejorative for a Jew, and Khrushchev relished using it. During dinner, however, the Soviet ruler changed his mind. He insisted that Day take products, not cash, from the Zhidani, so that even if the operation eventually leaked out, it would not look like a sale of slaves. Khrushchev's choice of quid pro quo barter object was livestock farms, as he considered himself an expert in the agricultural field. Pigs for pigs was the conclusion of General Sakharovsky, the head of the all-powerful Soviet espionage service, who had accompanied Khrushchev into Bucharest. So Romania started getting pig farms from Israel in exchange for exit visas for Romanian Jews. In the early 1970s, when I became the deputy head of the DIE, General Sakharovsky, still my de facto boss, took me on a tour of the infamous KGB interrogation complex in Moscow called Lefortovo to see a secret exhibit entitled 100 Years of War Against Zionism. I say that again, 100 Years of War Against Zionism. There, in that forbidding-looking prison built in 1881, I was shown the torture chamber used to extort confessions from the Jewish anarchists seized by the Okhrana, predecessor to the KGB, after Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1882. I set foot into the office where Martin Latzis, one of Felix Dzerzhinsky's deputies, signed the documents authorizing the Cheka to shoot tens of thousands of bourgeois Jews who were sabotaging the People's Revolution. I saw the cell where in 1938 the Cheka, now upgraded to GPU, or State Political Directorate, forced the founder of the Third International, an international communist organization, Nikolai Bukharin, to write a confession of dastardly crimes committed on behalf of American Zionism. So, right at the time, 60s and the 70s, right at the time when the Kremlin was internally, the Kremlin and the KGB, they were internally telling their higher-ranking people, yeah, we're totally anti-Semitic. We're fighting Zionism. We're just it's a continuous war. It's a forever war against the Zionist conspiracy. But at the same time, 60s and the 70s, in 60s and 70s, the communists were claiming in the outside world, especially the West, there's this fascist mega conspiracy in the West, and this fascist conspiracy is still using anti-Semitism. So brave communists, from the old timers to the young kids now, brave communists, they have to fight this conspiracy, to save Jews and save us all from fascism.
Well, Francis Parker Yockey, the American Nazi who wrote the book Imperium, he got into bed with the KGB. He even went to Havana to meet with communist officials there. He was one of the leading Nazi agents in the United States, probably during World War II. I think it was in 1960 or 61. He was arrested at the Oakland airport. He was caught with around 50 different false IDs on him. They put him in jail where he committed suicide. He did meet with Willis Carto there in jail. Willis Carto went to see him. Willis Carto was the one that published his book Imperium. But the book Dreamer of the Day covers how he sort of disappeared. And it's thought that he disappeared into East Germany, behind the East Bloc, that he came to view, he has a certain view of Russia, the Soviet Union in Imperium, but he comes around to this idea that of Eurasianism, that Russia is the real homeland of the white people of the Eurasian, the one common European home, which we see pop up later with people like Dugin. And there's this connection between Eurasianism and fascism. So that when we first see Dugin becoming politically active towards the end of the Soviet Union, it is the national Bolshevist movement that, what was it, Limonov that he formed that with, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was an attempt to sort of merge, a red-brown alliance, merge fascism with, or Nazism or anti-Semitism with communism, which has always been a kind of thing they've done, at the same time being anti-fascist on the one hand and supporting fascist groups, just the same way they did with Hitler. The same way when you look at the early Hitler, and Viktor Suvorov in The Chief Culprit begins with this, that early on in the Nazi movement, where it was the German Workers' Party, I think it was right. It was the German Workers' Party at first, and then it became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis praised Lenin as a great man, right? And there was Karl Radek would go to really, and Karl Radek was Jewish, went and was negotiating with the Nazis before the Munich beer hall push. There was going to be a communist uprising in Berlin. At the same time, the Nazis grabbed Bavaria, right? And that was 1923. And of course, this connection, this Red-Brown alliance, which went on in the early Weimar period, there was an off again, on again. There was Stalin actually telling the German Communist Party that they should not support the Social Democrats in blocking Hitler from becoming chancellor, and that they should allow it, and that so it's very funny. They even sacrificed the German Communist Party, and of course a lot of communists joined the Nazi Party, and Hitler even bragged at one point that some of the best National Socialists had been communists. Of course, among these, we've got people like Goebbels, who really was far from the far left. And I think the point has been made that the Nazi Party was a party in which they eventually evolved to appealing to conservatives, appealing to the right. Hitler would pretend that he would bring the monarchy back, right? Tickle the Kaiser and his parties, because the Kaiser was living in exile in Holland at the time. But it was all nonsense. And of course, the war started, World War II started, when Hitler and Stalin came out openly as allies to partition Poland, for which Hitler sort of got tricked and ended up at war with Britain and France, and Poland, whereas the Russians got away with invading Poland some days later, on the 17th of September, 16 days later, didn't get anybody to declare war on, and went on to invade Finland and the Baltic states and to lop off a chunk of Romania without getting the West. West was just, the Western Allies were pinned down dealing with Hitler. And they thought, well, we can't declare war on Stalin too. That would be a losing proposition. So it's very interesting how that all evolved. And we're seeing now they always repeat the same strategies with the Russian. I think the Russians, Stalin's name for Hitler was the icebreaker of the revolution. There's a book, Viktor Suvorov did, The Icebreaker, and then the chief culprit continues it, that Hitler was going to be the one, they were going to cause a schism in the West, a war in the West. And now we see they're trying to manipulate Trump into this position, right? Trying to get Trump to break with NATO, trying to get, wine and dine Trump to be Russia's ally. Oh, all these people are coming forward and saying that Russia and China, Russia can be wooed away from China. And, these terrible people, like I guess I would be one of them, have pushed Russia into China's arms, blah, 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 all that nonsense. But the whole time, they're just trying to create a rift in the West, right? This is what they're trying to do. And they're trying to get,
I mean, it worked. I mean, it worked out. It worked out to a significant degree. I mean, as I said this before, when the communist terror organization, the RAF, the Red Army faction, was active in West Germany, they had a couple of million of sympathizers in the population, and so you can always kind of do that research, who's believing what in any given country, and you see how good your operation is going along, how you can change people's opinions, where the limits are. And there was always going to be a hard limit. There was always going to be just a finite number of people that you could turn onto this marketing, this anti-fascist marketing, and we're preventing this big right-wing conspiracy. And that's where ultimately the KGB, or this particular leadership, the KGB ultimately decided to have a new approach, have many ideological faces, and try to infuse Marxism, Leninism infuse Marxism-Leninism into every one of the 5 major political ideological categories: left, middle, right, libertarian, and conspiracy mythology. So you push that into all these 5 categories, and now you can do the same program all over again. You tell every single group, you're the chosen group, you're the last generation that can create paradise on earth and also prevent hell on earth. You're part of the rebellion now, and it's tailored to each specific group, even the political middle. And it's more tricky to lure the political middle, but it's possible. It's easier with the right wing. It's easier with the libertarians, and it's also easier with the truthers. I mean, somebody commented under our last video and said, or asked, well, was the John Birch Society really that bad? Was it really so bad? And my core problem with the Birch Society was that by using or relying so heavily on traditional conspiracy mythology, they were opening this whole can of worms. Whereas in a system like an American system, where there's a system, there's a structure, and within the structure you can accuse anybody of being part of what I call the windmills of Zion conspiracy. Because you have the central bank, you have the big merchant banks, you have the titans of industry, and you have the political system, and this is all integrated. So everybody who has any influence and power is somehow attached to the system. And whenever somebody is not, with your preferred program, you can accuse that person of being part of this Jewish conspiracy. Anytime somebody does something you don't like.
I should mention this Jacob Schiff story, because you mentioned how many Jews Lenin had went out to execute. What was that number again?
Tens of thousands. Well, it was many different instances.
The leading Jew in the world at that time of the Bolshevik Revolution following it was Jacob Schiff. He was a Lower East Side banker, very significant person. And he was accused by the communists, and Felix Dzerzhinsky's Cheka had, of course, infiltrated the diaspora, and they were spreading this anti-Semitism into the West. Henry Ford picked up on it. And in the Dearborn Observer, his paper, he published the protocols of the Elders of Zion and this whole thing. And among it was an accusation against Jacob Schiff, who was, of course, the leading Jew. And if there was a Jewish conspiracy, Jacob Schiff would have been the leader of it. And he claimed that Jacob Schiff financed the Bolshevik Revolution, which is a complete lie. And you can go to there's a really good biography on Jacob Schiff that came out, I don't know, it was 10 years ago, maybe more than that now. And I have it, and it's just very well done. And the truth of the matter is that this, when the leading Jewish people in the world got together, and Schiff, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, Schiff insisted that the Jews put their money behind the whites, behind Admiral Kolchak. And this was the debate. The whites had these black hundreds, had these anti-Semites in them. We all know this is famous. But Jacob Schiff said at the time, look, the communists are killing the Jewish bourgeoisie. They're killing Jewish businessmen. They're taking Jewish businesses. And they're even worse than the White Army. They're worse than the Black Hundreds. Now imagine the leading Jewish, he had a lot of gravitas, Jacob Schiff, is there telling his fellow Jews, look, it's really rough in Russia. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the whites, anti-Semitism in the Reds. And he said the Reds are worse. Let's put our money behind Kolchak. And then for the Reds to go and say that Schiff was behind they wanted to blacken the name of Schiff. They wanted to create this Jewish because it creates such confusion on the anti-communist right. And they can poison it. They could make it toxic. And this spread throughout Europe, and of course the Germans. It's natural for people to try to find somebody to blame for why they lost World War I. the stab in the back, the whole thing that Hitler picked up on, to infuse it with anti-Semitism. And that was even taking off in Great Britain, to where you had even Churchill initially accepting it. And then in the London Times, in the pages of the London Times, I think it was a professor, I can't remember his name, he was looking at the protocols, which was spreading everywhere, and he said, wait a minute, this is a forgery. And he looked at a book called, I think the rough translation from French is Conversations of Machiavelli and Montesquieu in Hell. And he could see that major passages in the protocols was copied word for word out of this obscure book from, I think it was written in the latter days of Napoleon III, right? Because it was a critique of Napoleon III's policies, if I remember correctly. And so it was obscure. By the time you get to this book, it was the Russian general was the head of the Okhrana in Paris, who was an admirer of Napoleon's head of secret police, Fouché, who invented this Jewish Masonic conspiracy theory on his basis of his own intrigue, under Napoleon, that this basically began. And so this guy, they started publishing the side-by-side, these sources. I think there was another source they plagiarized from, I forget the details. And so in the English-speaking world, except for some of these ignorant Americans like Henry Ford, they could see that this was a complete fabrication. I mean, the head of the John Birch Society, the president of the John Birch Society, Jack McManus, I had coffee and pie at a mutual friend's house in Mission Viejo back in, I think it was 93 or 94. And he shocked me because I had read the research of the ADL and the B'nai B'rith that the Birch Society was actually secretly anti-Semitic, that Robert Welch believed in the protocols. And I was shocked when basically Jack McManus came out and expressed his belief in the protocols. And I said, but they're a forgery. Oh no, you've been duped. You've been duped. It's not a forgery. Why would you say that? This is what Jack McManus said to me. And, I'm telling the truth. This is what I heard out of his own mouth. And I was sort of myself going into the John Birch Society trying to find out if this was true. What is the truth about them? And so at that minute, I hit the jackpot because I had the president telling me this. Now if he had repeated that to the membership of the John Birch Society, they would have lost more than half their members. True. Because they pretend to not believe this. Oh, we support Israel. We're capitalists. We don't support this Nazi anti-Semitic thing. I mean, he even told me that Hitler was the dupe of the Jews, to drive the Jews out of Europe into the footstool of the Antichrist Israel, right? And I asked him, well, what is this conspiracy? Who's the head of it? Well, it's 9 Jewish Kabbalists, black magicians, who control the world through the banks and the Masonic lodges, right?
Yeah. I mean, the protocols are such a lazy forgery. It could always only work in combination with all these other myths and in combination with some visible people like the Rothschild Bank. I mean, at least the Rothschild Bank existed, but pretty much all the other stuff that was being written about, all this other stuff didn't even exist. And so normally, if you wanted to make a good forgery, right? If you're a professional intelligence agency and you really want to make a good forgery, you would actually incorporate incriminating evidence that's not public, that wasn't public yet. You would put some incriminating evidence against individuals. You would reveal some stuff that you actually know and nobody else knows. You would put some innuendo. You would mix some facts with speculation. You would need something that's actually verifiable so you can sell the additional garbage. But that wasn't even done. The protocols are a gimmick. It's just like it's kind of like the book, it's like the conspiracy book Bloodlines of the Illuminati by Fritz Springmeier. He wrote this previous book that was too long and totally convoluted, and I think nobody bought it, and it was a big failure, I think. The title was something with a snake. I remember that. And I remember the book being so convoluted, it was unreadable. So his next thing was a short book, very simple style and very gimmicky. He needed a gimmick concept. And so he came up with this concept, one way or the other, of saying it's 13 bloodlines that run the Illuminati, because the number 13 sounds sinister and it implies that you have special wisdom, and there's like you said, the 9 Kabbalists or whatever. There's got to be a number attached to it. And so he had a chapter about each bloodline, but he kind of ran out of steam at some point. He just had to make two bloodlines up completely, more or less. I think the Freeman family or something, or some Chinese family he basically ran out of steam, and he had to come up with 2 more so he would get to 13. And so it's a gimmick. It needs to be like, okay, it's this, and it's 13 total. And it was kind of the same thing with the protocols. They needed a gimmick. So they said it's going to be a number of protocols, and the additional gimmick is that this was the strategic plan revealed by some big conspirator, and this plan got leaked. So you're reading the original ramblings of the conspiracy person, this Jewish overlord or whatever. And so by having this gimmick, it's different protocols, right? It's gimmicky. It's what the readers kind of wanted. But if you read the different protocols, it's chaotic. There's no structure really to it. So somebody had this idea, I have to make these different chapters called protocols, even though there's no rhyme or reason to any of this. They're not sorted according to any discernible structure. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, bunch of repetition. And it's so baseline that anybody could have written it. It was so easy to put that stuff together. And by that time, there was decades and decades and decades already of anti-Semitic literature. Anybody who could get these books, which wasn't hard, could have cobbled together a new one. And so,
I should interject that the Catholics were susceptible because of the way Catholicism, there had been anti-Jewish agitation, and the Catholics had associated Masonry and Judaism and these things together. So it wasn't, I don't think it was a coincidence that Jack McManus was a very strong ultra-Catholic. And you have E. Michael Jones, who also takes this pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian line and has written the book, what is his book? The Spirit of Jewish Revolution or something like that. A very thick book. And he's a person with a lot of learning. He's very erudite. He got booted out as a university professor. I forget what school he was at. He wrote a rather interesting book on music, on evolution of music as a cultural indicator. I thought it was quite well done. But he is a virulent anti-Semite, connected to the Dugan networks, really a toxic individual. But he doesn't take the crude protocols of the Elders of Zion approach. He has a much more sophisticated set of arguments. He argues that the Jews are the murderers of Christ, etc., the synagogue of Satan thing that you see. And I don't think it's also, someone pointed out to me that Candace Owens' husband is a British Catholic, right? He's in charge of Turning Point UK, just like Charlie Kirk was Turning Point USA. And I suspect, that it's coming from some kind of E. Michael Jones kind of scholarship where you're interpreting history in a way, and a lot of the really Catholic conspiracy notions about history, about a satanic conspiracy, are traced by Jones, where the Jews are I guess you'd say, if Jones would claim that the Jews are these are sort of the core of the satanic conspiracy, like what McManus told me. There's these 9 Jewish black magicians. They're sort of the chief worshippers of Satan. You could say.
Yeah, and of course, I mean we have
the Antichrist. Yeah.
we have roughly 10,000 years of recorded history about empires, actual empires of a large size or even a mega size, and how they competed with each other, and we understand the espionage aspect a lot more. So this is thousands of years, even before there were any Jewish people around. This was a competition that was so fierce and was fought not just with methods of warfare, but also methods of spying and all these techniques
and the manipulation of religious themes. You go back to Persia, ancient Persia, which is the first really super empire, the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great. You see Cyrus the Great liberating the Jews from Babylon. You see this infusion of the Zoroastrian religion all over the place. Its influences spreading, but they're Eric Voegelin called it ecumenism, and the Romans did it too. It's where you try to meld your religion and insinuate it into everyone else's to bind everybody together with you.
Exactly.
Together with you, and this is what we see this in the history of the religious wars. The Reformation. We have the breakup of the European unity when the Catholic Church was unified, when it was all, they had the Eastern Orthodox. They were trying to get back together in the 15th century, but it didn't quite last or hold. But you had this concept of ecumenism, which has been attempted over and over again. But over time, of course, people disagree. They don't see eye to eye theologically, and you end up with splits. And so it's hard to keep things unified, but there's always people attempting to create, you could say, ideologies or theologies that will bring people together, innovations. This is what Dugin, by the way, and the Duginist movement, it's ecumenical, but not just within Christianity. They're using the Orthodox Church, of course, and they're trying to influence Catholics, but they're also bringing in Muslims, trying to bring in, and they're teaching young people, well, all religions are really teaching the same thing. Here's the esoteric underlying truths under all these religions. And it's an attempt when Russia and China and the communists are trying to, instead of fighting religion and killing all the religious people, taking over the religions, making a world religion, and having communism masked underneath it. This seems to be the project. Would you agree with that?
Well, here's the thing. When I was in London earlier this month, we visited a very interesting place. It's right in the middle of London, right? There's these big office towers and some very historical buildings that look like temples, like Roman or Greek temples. It's an astounding city. I've never seen anything like this. And then we wanted to see a preserved little temple of the cult of Mithras, which was built by the Romans. They built these little mini temples, which is very exclusive.
And you might tell the audience where Mithras comes from.
Well, this is kind of the pervasive mystery that some experts have been delving into. But the Persians had a version of this. The Persians had a version of this, and then, as you explained, it kind of, the structure kind of moved from place to place, and it got changed a bit and adapted. But here we were in the middle of London, and my phone navigation says you go straight, you go left, you go right, and then there must be the entrance. Or there's like office buildings, like super expensive office buildings. And I'm like, where is this thing? And then you see a little sign for an entrance, and we found it. So you go in there, and there's a little lobby, but very high-end, expensive, fancy, kind of dark and creepy. And then you have to wait for the scheduled tour of the actual temple of the cult of Mithras, which is underground. Because this was kind of a big thing that this cult was very, very fond of. It had to be very, very secluded. This wasn't a fancy temple that everybody could see from the outside, where you could trace who built it and what this group was. but this was secluded. This was often underground, kept very simple. So you couldn't trace the builders, you couldn't trace the owners. You couldn't tell much from what you would find accidentally. So you go down the staircase, and there it is. Black walls around, very dark, very creepy, and you see the remains of this temple of the Mithras cult. And then they explain something about it, and then they have this light show with audio. They try to recreate some of the ritual chanting that must have been going on, and they give you this atmosphere with this very dark light, very dark show with the specific lights that they use to give you a feeling of what it was like being in that cult. And this is right in the middle of London, and you can find these little temples on German territory now. You can find this in Italian territory. You can find this even in North Africa. So wherever the Roman Empire was at a specific time, they had these Mithras temples.
And wasn't Mithraism males only? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah. I mean, it was something that was so exclusive that had very few members. They would kill you for speaking about this to anybody. But as far as archaeologists could tell, this was not just a cult just for the aristocracy or just for the total leadership at the very top. They had members from the military, trade, this, that, and the other. So it would be a perfect way of encompassing the different aspects of the empire, right? And so this was basically much older than much older than Freemasonry.
Mithras was a solar deity. It was about the sun.
Yeah, it was. I mean, as far as we can tell, which is very little, by the archaeological remains that had been found, it was kind of a sun god type thing, and they have different symbols like the bull.
And I've read that and it was big in the Roman army, and I've read that Constantine the Great, when he recognized Christianity as because it had been persecuted under Diocletian, and Constantine recognized it, and there were no more real persecutions. I mean, Julian the Apostate showed up later, but one of the things that I read is that Constantine also may have been in this Mithra cult. Have you read that?
It's an astounding selection of different types of people. I mean, ranging from emperors essentially to people that were considered somewhat lower in society, but still had influence over larger groups of people.
Centurions in the army, people that
the seclusion thing is really creepy, because these people normally are used to amenities and luxury and preferred treatment. Why would they go to the most secluded places, most hidden? And so this was very popular in the Roman system, and this goes back to similar cults that were much older and much older and much older. So these systems had been around. So how could anybody in his right mind make these claims that Jews invented cult behavior and getting together with these occult rituals and blah 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 blah? This was everywhere, okay? And the Romans had it, and others had it, and they tried to perfect this system. And this, we learn more and more about the secret aspects of Rome and the other empires. How good they were at spying, and even when it came to counterintelligence, because every empire was fragile. So they were cracking down on speech. They would not allow free speech, not just because everybody was evil in the past. It's not as simple, this would be like a primitive answer, but because subversion was a real danger. If your fragile empire would be cracking here and starting to crack there, you could lose it all, and you would be taken over by a different empire. And so They were cracking down on speech. They were spying pretty much like you would expect on all kinds of groups, having informants and getting information and a sense of what population groups were feeling or maybe plotting, or what foreign agents may be plotting. And so propaganda was, or subversion was fought to a large degree. And so when we fast forward to the modern era, and we have a lot of subversion. I mean, you mentioned the husband of Candace Owens. I mean, there's so many aristocratic Brits, because her husband is from an aristocratic family. There were so many Brits who did this stuff. Here is Alan Percy. Alan Percy, the 8th Duke of Northumberland. From 1921, he funded the Boswell Publishing Company. Then in 1922, until his death, The Patriot, a radical right-wing weekly which published articles by Nesta Webster. And so this was kind of the British network that was feeding this anti-Semitic nonsense, the whole Protocols of Zion garbage. They were pushing this very, very hard. When you talk about these kind of guys, these dukes and barons and people of that with that status, they were very close to people from the House of Hessen, and they could have asked them, are these Rothschild claims true? Did they steal from the House of Hessen, on European soil or German soil, when the first Rothschild, meaningful, more influential Rothschild, when he was working for the Landgraf of Hessen and was supposed to hide the Landgraf's money from Napoleon's troops. Did this Rothschild really steal a lot of money from the House of Hessen? The House of Hessen could have told them no. They could have told the Duke of Northumberland. They could have told Churchill. They could have told Nesta Webster and all these publishing houses, because that, no, that's not true. And the other Rothschild myths are also not true. More like it's kind of likely that the Rothschilds were mainly working for Britain and maybe even spying for Britain, in France and other places. But that's a whole nother that's a whole nother story. And so it's your people are playing not just with fire. People are playing with something like the ideological equivalent of smallpox, because smallpox can infect people and infect the next people and kill a bunch of people.
Well, this is the point that's made by Desmet in his book on the psychology of totalitarianism and mass formation. And cults can be the carriers of these things. There are secret cults in societies. They have existed. They go in and out of existence. There's the real crazy idea that the Birchers and these conspiracy people think is they think there's a continuous satanic conspiracy going back thousands of years, and that it's Jewish, whatever. They always it's tendency to put the Jews. And you talk about the Mithra cult. Before that, in 186 BC. There had been a Dionysian or a Bacchanalian cult in Italy that Plato had even mentioned. They would celebrate, they'd have this Bacchanalia 3 days a year. But all of a sudden, the Roman Senate gets this information that this cult has gotten out of control. It's gone underground. They're celebrating not 3 days a year, but 5 times a month. Having orgies, sacrificing people and forging wills, real corruption. This thing is going nuts, these people who are doing it. This is about 186 BC. So the Roman consul, Postumius Albinus, this is all according to Titus Livy, investigated these charges when they first appeared. And people were like, no, this can't be true. And of course, laid his findings before the Senate, and they were shocked that this was happening and it was spreading. And they thought, this is going to destroy our society if this spreads. And so the Romans came down hard on it. They crushed it. But there's always a danger of, you look at pedophilia today. I mean, you look at the Franklin cover-up in Nebraska and some of the other things that are going on. You look at the Pizzagate weirdness, what's going on, what's behind that. People can get into this kind of thing and go and be nuts. And the corruption can spread within an establishment. I mean, we're all looking at the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how many elite people were affected or infected by what exactly?
There's a difference between chasing ghosts and fearing ghosts and just be influenced so much by things that probably don't exist or may not exist. But there's a difference.
Hysteria.
Yeah, but there's
a hysteria that can enter into it. Yeah.
There's a difference between that and being mindful that we don't have all the information about different groups currently and in history. There may be more than we currently know, and you can sort of try to calculate probabilities.
Yeah, there's always things we don't know, but of course the idea that, that there's these perfect conspirators who can make history, control history, and make everything turn out the way they want. That's not how human history reads.
Yeah, I see it more like I see it more like a continuation of methods. It's like when something worked 10,000 years ago, it worked 5,000 years ago, and then it may still work today. It's just a method that's being copied. Yeah. But
these cults aren't. It isn't all connected to Judaism. It isn't a Jewish thing. These things, they come from different, they come from Persia, they come from Greece, they come from wherever, and they're like you say, mind viruses. And
of course, the classic nonsense that we still hear today that Freemasonry is Jewish, especially the original British or English Freemasonry, that this is the Jewish conspiracy. I mean, have you walked around have you walked around London? You go around London and you and in this mega city in London, you see so many basically Greek temples and Roman temples, all the treasuries, the this, the that, this government building, this, that, and the other. They're modeled after Roman temples, Greek temples, and some stuff that's even older. This is not Jewish design. This is not, the Jews did not have these kind of temples. Those were the Romans. Those were the Greek. And then we kind of walked along the river, the Thames, and then there's this original 100% original Egyptian obelisk right at the shore with a big plaque that explains something, who got this thing from Egypt and shipped it over, and it almost got lost or it almost broke apart, but they got it back in one piece and they erected it, and the British elite, the king at the time, was so happy that they actually got it there. This is Egyptian. This is not Jewish. And you can visit Freemasons Hall in London. A lot of times they're semi-open to the public.
Isn't the idea the Masons are the builders of the pyramids, right? Isn't that one of the ideas?
And it's like when Freemasonry, it kind of needed a legitimate looking, at the time, a legitimate looking entry point into the ancient world and what it was about, and the mystery cults.
Yeah, and they were mythologizing.
Yeah, and so what could they possibly pick as a legitimate sounding entry point, so that you wouldn't freak out everybody who was getting into it, and because anybody who could try the first degree or the second degree or whatever, they could drop out, or you could throw them out and say you're no longer a Mason, we don't want you. So this person would not have anything shocking to say. So they picked as an entry point some little bits and pieces from the Old Testament. And that's why people have been claiming Freemasonry is Jewish, it's all totally Jewish, blah, 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 when this was just picked as an entry point. And when people progressed, especially with further degree systems and whatnot, you see a lot of Egyptian stuff and the about Zoroastrian thoughts and Roman and Greek and Egypt, and they're fascinated with their symbols. So it's, you could walk through London yourself and see what this is. Now,
and just while you're mentioning that, I wanted to ask you about the Illuminati to refresh my memory and everyone else's, because I had a reader ask me about the Illuminati after my last article, and touching on Robeson's proofs of a conspiracy and its connection to the English and what was going on. I remember more recently I read what Goethe said about the Illuminati, which I think he joined, right? He said that he got to the top of that, 33 degree or whatever it was, and he said they didn't have any secrets. It was a fraud. They didn't know anything.
Well, the thing about they needed, especially England or British Empire, Britain, they needed a religious-like system or a cult system that would work for or on scientists. See, that's a conundrum, right? Initially the Royal Society for Science, it was around the 1600s, and when you look at it, how it was in the 1600s, it was halfway scientific and halfway Rosicrucian. There was a lot of, mumbo jumbo in it, which was the case for quite a while. You had the initial stages of modern science and still mumbo jumbo, and at some point, the new British king and his very large family, became king in 1714. In 1717, they decided, we're gonna split these two things apart. We're gonna have the Royal Society for Science, and then we're gonna have this thing we call Freemasonry, which was based on an older Scottish template, and they have a whole backstory on that. But we just claim it's new. We just claim we came up with this Freemasonry thing, basically in a pub, or some powerful people in a pub, they came up with Freemasonry. And so the Masons are going to do the mumbo jumbo type thing or the mystery thing. This is going to be the Masons, while the Royal Society will focus super hard on science. But it wasn't a total separation. It was encouraged, because those were sister organizations, it was encouraged that high-ranking, powerful scientists, that they would become Freemasons. And they would be able to use these things or do these things at the same time, but also separate. So you could separate them.
It's kind of like the science part is sort of neo-Aristotelian, and the mystery part is sort of Neoplatonist. Would that be fair to say?
Well, they all come full circle in the end, because to properly do the science, they needed scientists who could, at least temporarily, be not religious. Just either they were supposed to be atheists and poo-poo, regular religions, supposed to be atheists, or they could be temporary atheists, focus on a scientific tasks, and then go to a lodge meeting or a lodge ritual later. So
Sir Isaac Newton, who was very much a Christian, but also was involved in astrology, involved in occult. Yeah. I mean, he had, people don't realize, he came up with his, what was it, Principia Mathematica or whatever it was. And of course they had this mystical math idea, but he was really steeped in mysticism. Sir Isaac Newton was, which I think shocks a lot of people. And of course, so but he was very much a Christian, very much steeped in the Bible at the same time.
Yeah.
And this, I think, it confuses a lot of people. And of course, this mechanistic view of the universe that grew into the sort of assumed materialism, and positivism of modernity, where you get to Darwin and you get to communism, which of course dialectics is not mechanistic, but it turns out everyone takes it to be, because it's all about naturalism and materialism. It sort of, you got a lot of people who don't believe in the soul anymore. You get a lot of people over the last 300 years that They can't believe in anything supernatural. They can't believe in religion anymore. They've made political religions like National Socialism and communism that are very materialistic, that are very deterministic. And this movement has been very destructive of sort of the deeper soul felt structures that made Western civilization.
Yeah, but they could do both as well, because some scientists they would not follow a traditional religion, but they would be more and more interested in Freemasonry, and they wanted to make this all come full circle. And when physics became more advanced and you looked into the universe with telescopes and you kind of understood more about it, and over time, eventually discovering quantum physics and all these things, eventually it seemed to come full circle to these people. It's science, but there's also kind of still the air of mystery about it, the air of mumbo jumbo about it, that you are somehow connected with entities. And when I was in London,
connected to daimonic, the Greek concept of daimonic entities, right?
Yeah, entities you cannot really fully describe because you're much more primitive than they are, but you can sort of work with them, or you can
like demons and angels, right?
You can sort of tap into them and then create great things in science. I mean, I watched them when I was in London. I watched a movie in an IMAX theater. Which was supposed to be the biggest screen in Britain. This was an older movie that they showed in IMAX because it was sort of made for that format. It was Interstellar by Christopher Nolan.
I saw that movie.
And in Interstellar, they are praising science. They're totally glorifying science. Only science can save us. But at the same time, it's an element of mumbo jumbo. Ghosts, but interdimensional beings and transcending time and everything. So you cannot. This is the point in the end of the movie when you cannot distinguish anymore what's science and what is ghosts or entities or mumbo jumbo. It's all full circle. It's a very Masonic movie in my opinion, and this sort of embodies the British system at the time. When you go to the Natural History Museum. And how much the empire was based on science, the warships, technology to keep the empire running. And when this
touches on what you just said is interesting, because Peter Kingsley, who wrote this book on Parmenides called Reality, he's saying that the ancient Greeks developed science by going into caves. The people were called incubators, and they were channeling they were basically channeling Hades, right? They were channeling entities. They were sitting down and having, I think the symbolism was they were having like a dinner party with the queen of Hades, right? Persephone, I think, is one of the names she goes by. So this is part of what, and of course he's in Oxford, he's an Englishman, Kingsley is. And then you've got Patrick Harper writing the book Demonic Reality, actually even proposing that UFOs are coming out of this. Interesting when you've got the head of the committee in Congress, Anna Paulina Luna, saying on Joe Rogan that, they're interdimensional. UFO pilots are interdimensional entities, right? Yeah. Beings. This is very spooky stuff, but I wanted to also interject another kind of conspiracy theory that people have, that where the Renaissance comes in, you had in the early 15th century, in the 1400s, before the fall of Byzantium, this guy, Georgios Gemistos Plathon, he was reintroducing Plato and Platonism, coming to Italy when they were having the discussions between the Eastern Church and the Western Church for ecumenism, to bring them together. He was making converts to Plato. He influenced the Medicis. He brought the Hermetic literature, which the Medicis got so excited they said, stop translating this Platonic stuff, start translating the Hermetic texts. And this brought this infusion of I just learned this recently. I didn't know Platon was a secret pagan who believed in the Greek gods, the ancient Greek gods. Of course, he was a Eastern Greek, the Eastern Empire. And of course, that was still considered the Eastern Roman Empire. The Turks were banging on their doors and took, I think it was, what year was it? 1420 something, or was it 14? I forget the date when Byzantium fell. Maybe it was 1450s. I don't remember, but they had all these Greek manuscripts of Plato and other ancient philosophers. They're bringing them into Italy, right? This is starting this is fueling the Renaissance. But and he had written, what Gemistos had done is that he had written this secret book to reestablish the secret rituals and concepts of the ancient Greek polytheistic religion, Hellenism. And he was spreading it among Italians and God knows who else. I think it ended up in Germany from there. But he was spreading it, and he was so confident that people were so excited that he was going to convert everybody to paganism that he actually told, I think, a cardinal that paganism was going to take over again. He had this belief, which got him into trouble. I think I think it was the head of the Eastern Church, the patriarch, who got a hold of this book and burned it. His book and burned it, except the parts.
The thing with, I mean, because one of your readers, I think you mentioned, asked about the Illuminati.
Yeah, about the Illuminati. What they describe what it was? Was it a British thing? Did the British bring that into Bavaria as some kind of infiltration operation?
Well, I mean, if you look deep and hard, and if you try to reconstruct, you're dealing with estimates, you're dealing with probabilities, right? So I think the probability is very, very high that the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati was a front group, by and large, a front group of British intelligence, which is more developed than historians believe.
Now let me interject something interesting, that Prince Metternich's father was in the Bavarian Illuminati. And what's interesting is the Metternichs they were Anglophiles. They became very pro-British. Yeah. And Metternich was very much working with, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, people like Castlereagh. There was this real connection, and it was really a decisive moment in Metternich's life when he went to London. And we don't know the full story of that.
Yeah, and you had some other very, very powerful aristocratic lines.
These are the guys that stopped Napoleon. These are the guys that stopped Napoleon.
In the Bavarian Illuminati, I think it was like Braunschweig, Wolfenbüttel, Sachsen, Coburg, and Gotha, Hessen, like some of the biggest, oldest families were. Had some of the biggest and oldest families had some people in the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati, but it was, I mean, the distinction, and it's also a distinction that we see in somewhat in these conspiracy bestseller books of the time, after the Illuminati went bust.
Robison, tell us about this, Robison. Because I was asked about that book.
Yeah, so John Robison was Robison's book Proofs of a Conspiracy became a best-selling book, and the author was a scientist. He was one of the leaders of the Royal Society. I mean, there was the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So he was a scientist through and through. So modern conspiracy literature was not created by some idiot in a basement. It was created by very powerful, very, very connected scientist. And he was part of a network, and that network also kind of ties it to Baruel, the French guy who also wrote about the Order of the Illuminati and that whole
later
scandal.
On, yeah.
And there was also German authors that were also tied to this network. Some were even former Illuminati members or tied to the Illuminati members.
So are the letters he presents in the book? Is the arguments he present? Is there forgeries in that? Is he putting out disinformation for political and to cover Britain's tracks?
Well,
in espionage in Bavaria.
Funnily enough, Robison Robison as well as Baruel, they both admit that there is a huge difference between British Freemasonry and this Order of the Illuminati. Now, what's the difference? Well, they explain, and this is mostly true, they say that British or English Masonry, English Freemasonry is very patriotic, total loyalty to the crown, total loyalty to the empire. They would never dare to do anything against the crown, against the empire. This would be like the last thing they would ever do, because Masonry was created for that purpose. It was created in 1717 under King George.
A brotherhood to preserve the empire.
The empire. It was kind
to
of
build the empire.
This was under King George the First, who was basically a German, but he belongs to an old family cluster. It is so large and so old it cannot even be considered German, but for sake of the argument, he spoke German, and he came from a place that is German, right? But so they created Masonry as a sort of parallel structure to the real aristocracy, because the empire was becoming more complex. They were giving more liberties to people.
And an important point, they're Protestant. They're not Catholic.
Yeah, and so they needed
and of course,
an organization.
Bavaria is a Catholic country, so you're crossing over from a Protestant Germany and Protestant England to Catholic Bavaria. So and suddenly this secret society thing is communistic. It's for overthrowing everything. It's for destroying and creating confusion. Yeah. I mean, how is that fit together? Yeah.
So they needed to create a system, almost like a bureaucratic system, which is kind of hidden, but a bureaucratic system for the empire to have an organized structure of privileged people. I mean, ideally, you would have, you would come from money or an older family. You would be a scientist or a trader or an aristocrat or a politician, somebody powerful from a lineage. Ideally, your father was a Mason before you and his father was a Mason before you. So it's like this multi-generational vetting. It's creating loyal, a structure of loyal people, loyal to the empire. And so this is where Robison is very accurate as a conspiracy author. This is where Baruel is very is totally accurate, because the Illuminati of Bavaria, totally revolutionary. They wanted to change everything. They hated the governments here. They hated the church here. They hated the mindset. They wanted to do something just very extreme and change the empires and break down empires.
Catholic Bavaria, right? In Catholic Bavaria.
Yeah. But not in. Yeah, but they they didn't have the same kind of reach into Britain. They wouldn't. The Illuminati of Bavaria, the Order of the Illuminati would not dare to touch Britain, really, to mess with Britain, because Illuminati members were from the oldest, most powerful families, like the House of Hessen, and they were pretty powerful in Britain. So the Illuminati
They turn out to be Anglophiles, right?
Yeah, the Illuminati were created to mess with continental Europe, German territories, French territories, some Italian,
German Catholic territories, and France is a Catholic country too.
Yeah, so it was tailor made to mess with different empires here, not mess with the British, not mess with this whole Rule Britannia thing, but to mess with the French and to mess with certain German territories. And it was very much different from English Masonry, and that's why the police went after them. And Masonry, even English Masonry is about creating and destroying. So it's not like you get a new degree in Masonry. Even the 33rd degree in a Scottish rite system or a 12th degree in another system, it's not like you get a new degree and they give you magic powers or they give you some super secret. It's all about continuing to increase your own ability to create and to destroy for the English Empire. You know, you create something, a scientific breakthrough, or you're a general in the British system and you manage to destroy an enemy force or destroy an enemy system. So you're constantly supposed to search and search for the light. It's not like masonry will give you all of it. It's not like it's handed to you. You're supposed to constantly evolve and constantly come up with new means and powers of destruction and creation. And so the Illuminati sort of copied that in a more radical way. Things to destroy and things to create. But this, when the order got busted by the police, it became a public scandal that reverberated all over Europe and the US and other places in the world. Everybody was talking about it. And so just a short time later, these conspiracy books come out, become bestsellers. There's even a German one that nobody remembers. I think it was by August von Stark, also an aristocrat. I think he was tied to the House of Hessen. Some other smaller books that were not as successful that nobody remembers, but they're all tied to Illuminati members. They're all tied to the House of Hessen. They're all tied to the Royal Society for Science. It's all a network. So it's the Illuminati people. I mean, this is absolutely verifiable. It's these Illuminati type people that created all these best-selling conspiracy books. And all these books have very much in common. All these books they protected Britain. They totally protected Britain. On every single darn page, they would say, no, there's no British influence. You know, this is not some British ploy. I mean, I've never would they do such a thing. No, one book said this was all Adam Weishaupt's fault because he misled these honorable aristocrats from like the House of Hessen.
Cui bono, right?
Yeah, he misled them. It was all Weishaupt's fault. And these aristocrats in the Illuminati, they're totally innocent. They're well-meaning people. They would never, do some dark stuff to hurt France. Would never do that. And so then it's this whole ludicrous idea that, some of these books said, no, it's not so much just Adam Weishaupt, it's these invisible others that we cannot really describe, maybe French people behind it, or maybe Catholic people behind it. They were behind this bad stuff of the Illuminati, and these poor members, a lot of these poor members got misled by these mysterious people in the background. So anything and everything was put forward as the dark force behind the Illuminati, but not Britain. Oh no, not honorable Britain, not the honorable King of Britain. They would never actually do such a thing to destabilize France. I mean, it's ridiculous. And
perfidious Albion.
Yeah, and so it's like this network which is tied to Britain, which is tied to Illuminati. This network came out with these conspiracy books, and they say Britain is totally innocent. This is not because if they hadn't controlled the narrative, after the Illuminati, the order of the Illuminati got busted, if they hadn't controlled the narrative with these conspiracy books, it could have compromised other networks, British and aristocratic networks, compromised these networks. You could have lost another network and another network because the Illuminati was not the only organization like it. It's just the one that people remember because their internal documents got busted and plastered all over, pamphlets and newspapers.
What's really interesting is you had the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics and the civil wars, the wars of religion in the 1500s, in the 1600s, the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, the Civil War in England. You had the Huguenots versus the Catholics in France, off and on these terrible wars, and the Edict of Nantes, and the Protestants win, but the Protestant king converts to Catholicism, and they heal the wound in France. They say we have to agree to disagree. We can't persecute people on religion, and you have this sort of maturing, which ends up in the Enlightenment. But it's very funny. The Protestant-Catholic divide doesn't go away immediately. It's preserved under the surface, and we can see it, for example, in the 7 Years' War. because you look at the 7 Years' War, and what is it? It's England and Prussia and these German states you mentioned that are all Protestant, fighting against all non-Protestant countries, fighting against Spain, France, Austria, all Catholic countries, and initially Russia, which is an Orthodox country. So you have this Protestant alliance in the 7 Years' War. This is 1756 to 1757 to 1763, right? The 7 Years' War. And you've got it ends, of course, in the victory of England. England defeats the Spanish fleet, the French fleet, takes over the Philippines, takes Cuba, takes India, takes Canada, takes over everything. And then, of course, they spite the French. They keep India and they keep Canada, but they give Cuba and the Philippines back to Spain because they want to make this. They don't want the Spanish permanently hating them. And it's very interesting. This whole thing is very interesting because the British Empire this is the first real world war fought all over the world. And the British are fighting it with their fleet. They established their hegemony on the seas very firmly at that time. And it's very interesting, the role. And here we have this Illuminati popping up in the wake of this war.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like there were many organizations like it because at the time, universities were the place to be. And we know from the 20th century that a lot of espionage was conducted inside universities, and spy networks were established inside universities. Also spy services or modern spy services, they recruited people from within the student body at a university. So it's like
sound familiar. What about the Cambridge moles and the communists?
Yeah, exactly. So you had all these major universities on German soil, and Germany was, for the longest time not a true unified empire. So you had different German territories. You had these universities, and of course the various aristocracies would control these universities. So this was a place to be. This is where the future scientists went to, or other powerful people went to. So of course, this was a place to focus on in terms of espionage and counter-espionage. And so multiple universities, they all had these new societies that popped up, and they would clad themselves into this cloak of enlightenment. They would call themselves an enlightenment group, and they would work in stages. They would get you into this group and say at first, "Oh, we're kind of cool. We're really the vanguard. We're cool, but we're not. No, we're not radical. We don't want to overthrow anybody." And then they would guide you through the different degrees and see how much they could use you for
and then you find out when you reach the final degree that you were really working for British intelligence.
something along those lines. This was, of course, this is how you would do it if you wanted to subvert an enemy, weaken an enemy. You would use these kind of organizations, and also these conspiracy books when they came out to control the narrative. I mean, it was like adding fuel to the fire in France, which had a civil war.
False flag recruitment, where people can't say that it's coming from you because you're recruiting them under a false flag.
Exactly. This was actually mentioned in Knigge's book. Mr. Knigge, he's most famous. I think most people, people over here, they remember the name from a very famous book on how to behave in different at specific events, or in your home, or in your job, or how do you treat different types of people, how to behave, or your table manners. This was like the handbook, and it got so popular that it became a common phrase. It's like if you have a rule book for good behavior, you would call it the Knigge for this particular field. So he got famous for that. But when you actually read that book by Knigge, he also has a chapter on should I or should I not join secret societies, believe it or not. And he had a very negative opinion, because this was after the whole Illuminati scandal, and he was a member. He was a high-ranking member. Aristocratic networks got him, I think, his wife, his career. This was kind of the same aristocratic network. It was tied to Britain. They got him a wife. They got him a career. He was very thankful for that, but this Illuminati thing, it didn't quite work out the way he had intended it to. And so he was kind of whining in his famous book, and he said, I mean, he wasn't referencing any specific names, but he was saying, yeah, there are these fancy new societies, and they seem very mysterious, and you know, young men of a certain status, they may want to join these things. Should you or should you not? And he's advising against it. And one of his arguments is that you would never know who's truly running it, which is a very fair point. But these conspiracy bestseller books, they were jabbing indirectly a lot at France. Because when Robison, in his best-selling book, Proves a Conspiracy, he's praising his king, and he's saying, I love British masonry, and I also went to Europe to the rest of Europe, and I checked out some lodges over there, and it was shocking. It was weird over there. I didn't like it over there. I'm not mentioning any details, but I didn't like it at all. I want my super nice, loyal, patriotic British masonry. So when people in France were, confronted with such thoughts, this would encourage people who were in France who were still loyal to the king, because here he is, John Robison, saying having a king is awesome, and our masonry is awesome, and loyalty to the king is awesome. So this would encourage the pro-king people, pro-monarchy people in France. And at the same time, the other best-selling conspiracy author, Baruel, is 4-volume series. He had more planned than 4 volumes. He would also say, I'm such a big fan of the church. I don't want anarchists ruining everything. I don't want these godless people just destroying these things and basically raising hell. So that was also encouraging for people in France who were still loyal to the old system. But the British, for a while, they also kind of encouraged the rebels or the revolutionaries in France. It was like a double strategy. You encourage this group and that group to fight each other. And while France was in a civil war, the British declared war on them. See how that works? So so subversion is something that's very, very serious, and that's why the French try to come up with these new laws. They had many iterations of their new foundational legal documents, the Constitution, and they amended it. Then they said, yeah, we can crack down on speech because we're in a civil war or there's so much subversion. It was tough for France to figure out how to give people more rights and at the same time not succumb to the subversion that was going on everywhere. So it became a legal thing, a modern legal thing, and this brings us right to the next stage. This was like the earlier 1800s, when some empires became more mature, like the British. The French were still in trouble. Germany was kind of in trouble. The United States was around, and then subversion hit a new level. This was the new left. These were socialists, and at the same time, you saw the next iteration, the next generation of conspiracy authors. And so this was merged. This was a left phenomenon. The truthers, the anti-Semitic truthers of that time, the earlier 1800s, they were leftists, right? And so a new level of subversion, communism. We hate all capitalism. We hate, trade, and we hate these new freedoms, and because this is all just a conspiracy. It's bad. We want to abolish basically all private property, and we want to abolish the rights to trade, to have businesses, and we want a specific type of government, run by socialist bureaucrats. So in order to get that socialist agitprop through the censorship, the government censorship, especially in France, but also Germany, they kind of blended it with modernized anti-Semitism. It was easier to say, capitalism is like this. Capitalism is like a blood-sucking, parasitic Jewish thing. It was easier to say that than to say it's just a parasitic, evil thing that the government is doing. So by blaming Jews, it was easier to spread the message, and this is what communism at that stage did. Now, at that stage, communists didn't have an empire yet. They didn't have a country yet. They didn't have... the only thing they had was subversion. So they latched onto this conspiracy thing, brought it to the next level, added all this anti-Semitism to it, right? Because the older conspiracy best-selling books, they didn't care about Jews. They didn't write about Jews. The Jews didn't play a role at all in Robeson's work and Bauer's work. So this is when communist subversion then really, really took off. And nowadays, we're again in this position that so many other countries had been before. How do you properly, legally react to a communist subversion, or other forms of subversion, which may or may not be run by Russia, by the KGB regime? Because they're not just using leftists now, they're using all 5 major political ideological categories: left, middle, right, libertarians, and the conspiracy crowd. Russia has infiltrated them all a long time ago, and they radicalized all of these 5 categories. Now, the Trump administration, the Trump administration has announced it wants to combat left-wing extremism significantly more in the wake of the Charlie Kirk shooting. The term that is being thrown around is anti-fascists or Antifa. Per the government's argument, left-wing individuals and networks justify violence by claiming it is the only viable way of fighting existing fascist structures or preventing a full-blown fascist dictatorship. The left's position now is outrage over the perceived ban of all opposition to fascism. But we are really dealing with 2 different concepts and 2 different or completely different legal frameworks. So we have a general opposition to fascism, and we have Marxist-Leninist anti-fascism. Totally different, and legal frameworks also very, very different. So almost everyone who cherishes constitutional government, civil rights, basic human rights, feels in some sense anti-fascist. Americans are not imperial British subjects anymore, and so there is a broad pluralist resistance to authoritarian ultranationalism. So there's different groups.
And by the way, I might mention in the confusion, you got different rhetoric, anti-fascist rhetoric in this. You've got the rhetoric of the libertarian and conservative right, which aligns fascism with Marxism, that basically says that Nazism, fascism, Marxism, Leninism are all fascist. You have Joseph Schumpeter, who basically in his Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy said, well, the joke's on the Marxists because Marxism in practice is a form of fascism. He wrote that in the 1930s originally. And so this is the conservative view of Marxism and fascism really being the same thing. Then you've got the communist view, which is not the same thing. It's a completely different thing. So you got people like well, in it, the lying, the lying AOC, right, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who after Charlie Kirk's death accuses him of being a racist and an anti-Semite, which is the same thing as calling him a fascist, right? This is what Antifa is saying, that he's a fascist. And this is the rhetoric to mobilize people. It's like Russia saying that the government in Kiev is Nazi. It's a completely different. It's a deceptive, and and of course you got Ian Kershaw, who wrote the famously biography of Hitler, who came out and said, "Well, there's no real definition of fascism. Defining fascism is like nailing jelly to a wall, right?"
Yeah.
It's just not, there is no fixed definition, because you got the left-wing scholars and the right-wing, so you got this disagreement on basic definitions. So everybody's throwing this word around until it's practically, I think in the American conservative and right, the word has become meaningless. All right, call me a fascist. It doesn't mean a thing. Everybody's a fascist who's not a left-wing radical revolutionary, right?
Yeah, so the phenomenon of Marxist-Leninist anti-fascism, a tactical banner that subordinates the anti-fascist struggle to the strategic objective of socialist revolution and one-party rule. In practice, this Leninist anti-fascism has usually ended in the establishment of police states that wield systematic violence long after open fascist threats have passed. So we need to understand the ends, the means, institutions, and the law, and then look at some specific examples. So how to deal with this? What is a proper way of handling this? What is real anti-fascism, and what is legitimate anti-fascism, and what is Marxist-Leninist anti-fascism? There's a consistent theme. General pluralist anti-fascism seeks to defend a constitutional order, while Marxist-Leninist anti-fascism treats that order as the obstacle to be overthrown, either in a storm of revolution or by a peaceful, quote-unquote, takeover that culminates inevitably in coercive one-party rule. So, general anti-fascism is defensive and preservative. It aims to keep open the space of constitutional politics, elections, independent courts, free press, protected opposition, and nonviolent contestation. It is not inherently tied to any single social theory of history. This is like the ends of general pluralist anti-fascism. Then the means. Non-Marxist anti-fascism relies on coalitions and legal instruments. It uses election, legislation, policing, under judicial oversight, and civic organizations. Institutions.
One key thing about fascism and authoritarianism that is, and this is where the American and British traditions are important, that especially with the Americans and the British, we have this notion of division of powers, checks and balances. You've got it in the British Constitution after the Glorious Revolution. We're not having an absolute monarchy. Our king is not absolute. Parliament's not absolute. You got the House of Lords has a veto. The House of Commons has a veto. The king has his say. Everybody has a check on everybody else. It's not a written constitution. This is how it effectively works, or worked in Britain, and eventually there's these attempts to sabotage that. They took the veto away from the House of Lords in 1911. But in the American Constitution, you not only have the federalist check with the power of the states, you've got the judiciary with its check on the presidency and on the Congress by being able to declare laws unconstitutional. You've got the Congress's check on the president because they can impeach and try him. You've got the president's veto power over the Congress. You've got a system of checks and balances. If you look at fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Leninist, Marxism, Leninism in Russia, or Putinism, or what you have in China today, there's no checks and balances in the sense that all power is concentrated in one party and one group, and the thing they don't want is any check on them. Their checks and balances are to increase the concentration of power, to maximize the power organs, right? So this is a very different idea of politics. When you go to the authoritarian states, it's about the concentration of power. There cannot be any. What was Hitler? It was one Reich, one Führer, one. One Reich, one Führer,
one population, ein
one people,
Volk, ein Reich,
right?
ein Führer. Yeah.
Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Exactly. And of course, it was totalitarianism was a word that I believe Mussolini invented, if I remember my political science 101. And of course, and you had democratic centralism in the Soviet Union under Lenin, and that basically meant that the highest committee, everybody's a Soviet's a committee. The highest committee makes up its mind, and then all the debate ends, and all the lower bodies, they all have to now snap to and obey. So you call that party discipline. So it's authoritarian. It's the communist idea of consensus.
So what are the what is Marxist-Leninist anti-fascism? So let's look at the ends, the goals, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marxism-Leninism reads fascism as the final terroristic stage of capitalist rule. In this framework, fascism is not an aberration, but the mask that finance capital dons when parliamentary tricks can no longer protect class power. Consequently, defeating fascism within a bourgeois republic is, for Leninists, never the final goal. The goal is to abolish the bourgeois state and replace it with the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, which in practice means the unchallengeable rule of a vanguard party. Then the means. There's two different tracks, two different methods, but the same destination. Track A, insurrection. When conditions ripen, war, economic collapse, demoralized armies, the party seizes power by force, dissolves rival centers of authority, and creates extraordinary organs of repression, like the Cheka, the OGPU, and KVD. Violence is not an accident, it is the instrument of state-making. Track B, the so-called peaceful road. When a frontal assault is impossible, the party advances by coalition, united fronts and people's fronts, to occupy the ministries of Interior, Justice, Information, and Defense, to neutralize or capture the police and security services, to merge or outlaw rivals, and to amend constitutions so that elections cannot dislodge the new order. The moment control is consolidated, systematic violence begins. Show trials, purges, expropriation, concentration camps, censorship, and the crushing of civil society. The violence.
And this is what Hitler did.
Yeah, well,
Hitler's method, formed a coalition with the conservatives, got himself chancellor, and then there was the Reichstag fire, and then you had the Enabling Act, right?
Exactly.
And then they started outlawing. And Hitler had always said, there's only going to be one party, and it's going to be us.
Yeah.
Right?
So the violence, and also Hitler, this is not the parallel. Hitler was also convinced that you could not really get anywhere within a bourgeois state. With these slow-moving conservatives, you could not do a revolution with them.
Right.
You needed these new guys, these crazy guys who could actually pull off a revolution. And so then,
and Lenin, the same thing. It was Lenin when they had their first attempt at democracy under the Bolsheviks. He just when the election wasn't going to go his way, he just used bayonets to drive them out.
Yeah, and so right wingers today, and especially those right wingers which are controlled by Russia, they will try to force everybody, bludgeon everybody to go with the program, become anti-Semitic, become a truther, become radical, to go with the program, and they will threaten you. You either go with the program or we will put you into the enemy category, and once we seize power, you're one of the enemies, and we will crush you because the violence is not a temporary wartime expedient, it is structural. So then
they're always moving in this direction. They're moving in this direction. They're trying. By the way, I should mention Desmet's book about the psychology of totalitarianism. Their mechanism for making this work, and you've listed all of them beautifully, but the capstone is that when you, and this is Desmet emphasizes this, it's very important to understand, is that when does this movement become effective? It's when mass formation occurs. How does that occur? It's when you've hypnotized about a third of the population, which is the minimum necessary to govern with complete authoritarianism. And that third of the population becomes so strong, they feel their power in the mass, right? And they're all hypnotized, and they believe they're right, and they believe they have the right to silence anyone who goes, no, that's not right, and starts to criticize what they're doing. They silence them. And they say, you can't speak against this. And that's when it becomes impossible, when any rational voices are silenced and they allow themselves to be silenced because people are scared. That's when it sets in hard and fast, and nobody can do anything against these people. So all they have to do is kill off the canaries that are singing and saying,
and even if you join the system, be it fascist system or a communist system, even if you join early, you still may be purged at a later stage. You may be one of the original guys. It's like Willy Münzenberg. He started to say, what is the stuff that Moscow is planning now? What are these new orders? This is not right. And so then they threaten him. They call him back home to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and he doesn't want to go. And they eventually they got him. They killed him, and he was complaining. I'm one of the original guys. I was in Switzerland with Lenin and the other.
Well, he was in Moscow with Dzerzhinsky and Lenin.
I'm one of the OGs. I'm one of the OGs. Why are you coming after me? But this is what happened, and this is also what happened with the Nazis. I mean, there were purges and there were secret assassinations and people starting to drop dead. And imagine if you're in the system and you start to realize that the leader and his closest advisors, that they're either crazy or inept, or some foreign influences there, or there's traitors everywhere. You cannot rectify that situation. There's no
you can't.
means.
You remember Hamstangl, the story of Putzi Hamstangl, who was Hitler's foreign press secretary, and he was half American and half Bavarian. And he had initially been a big supporter of Hitler, but he didn't like the anti-Semitism. He tried to arrange a meeting between Hitler and Churchill early on before Hitler came to power, where Churchill was going to say, hey man, drop the anti-Semitism. And Hitler wouldn't even meet with Churchill. He refused. Hamstangl was trying to get him, but Hamstangl was always, he felt because he was so close to Hitler, he could make statements. And it got to the point where Goering and Hitler and Goebbels and these people, they came to regard him as a liberal, as not a real Nazi. And so suddenly Goering tells him, you're going to Spain on a special mission. You're gonna do some reporting there, and the Spanish Civil War was going on, and so he's put on this plane to go to Spain. And the pilot tells him after they take off, he goes, look, they're going to kill you. This is not what they told you it was. They're going to murder you. And he said, I don't want to be part of this, so I'm going to fake that I'm having engine trouble, and I'm going to sit down in this other German airport, and you're going to get on a train, and you're going to get out of Germany, which he did. He went to England. And, of course, he was a major defector from the Third Reich because he was a guy who really was very important in the beginning of the Nazi Party, who defected. And this story is, he was starting to speak out, and they were just going to rub him out.
Yeah, so communist institutions means party above law. In Leninist anti-fascism, law is instrumental. Courts are subordinated to party legality. The press becomes an agitprop organ. Unions become transmission belts. The constitution is reinterpreted as a facade for party leadership. Separation of powers and independent civil associations are defined as bourgeois myths. And then, of course, the law is transformational and irreversible. Legal strategy is revolutionary. Use legality to become unremovable, then redefine legality so that the party's will is the law. Anti-fascism is the bridge from defensive rhetoric to authoritarian consolidation. So, of course, the example of the Bolsheviks, they used track A, meaning the violent uprising. The new regime created the Cheka as an extrajudicial weapon for eliminating class enemies. The Red Terror followed. Then you had the Kronstadt uprising of 1921, sailors who had once been Bolshevik allies. This uprising was crushed with artillery. Then the collectivization, dekulakization, this whole horror show, the Great Terror of 1937-38. This was the logic of revolutionary state building. And then other examples, Spain from 1936 to 1939, anti-fascism as a civil war and a purge. So the Spanish Republic's Popular Front government was opposed by a military rebellion led by Francisco Franco. International brigades and Soviet support flowed to the Republican side under the flag of anti-fascism. So this was the marketing, anti-fascism. Inside this republic, however, Soviet security services and their local allies suppressed independent leftists. They suppressed independent leftists. The POUM, an anti-Stalinist Marxist party, was outlawed. Its leaders were arrested or killed. Anarchist strongholds in Barcelona were attacked during the May Days of 1937. The anti-fascist camp thus contained a second front, a purge that prioritized party control over pluralist resistance. Spain demonstrates that Leninist anti-fascism views rivals on the left as an existential threat, often more urgently than it views fascism itself.
Yeah, I mean, in the Spanish Civil War, you had syndicalists. I mean, the Spanish Republic was very socialist. But the socialists were divided. There were anarchists, there were syndicalists, there were communists of various kinds. And once the Soviets got their foot in the door with the Civil War, they started to tighten their grip. And of course, it had a very negative effect, by the way, on the Republic's ability to wage war, it turned out. Of course, the Soviets ended up stealing the Spanish gold reserve of the Spanish government, which I think they still have it, right? But it's an example. And of course, Mussolini and Hitler backed Franco, but Franco was taking money. The English were supporting Franco secretly behind the scenes. And Franco ended up ultimately being loyal to the British, not to Hitler and Mussolini. That's why he didn't join the war with them, and he stayed out of the war and did not help Hitler, because Hitler could have closed the Mediterranean. If Spain had joined him, he could have taken Gibraltar, and that would have closed the Mediterranean to the British Navy, and it would have allowed Italy to win the war in the Med. And didn't happen.
That's a very good example of this short-sightedness of people when they join such a movement and they help with the revolution, and then they have this fascist system, for example, and then you think that you have these allies in Italy and Spain, but things turn out differently. It's not what was promised.
It's the same thing with Finland, by the way. Finland under Mannerheim, who was the defense minister and ultimately after the war became president, but he was really the eminence grise of the Finnish system. Finland was a democracy, and it was the only democracy to be on the side of the Axis, to be on the side of Hitler and Mussolini. But they were by necessity because the Soviet Union invaded them. And what the fascists didn't realize was, as much as Finland fought on the same side as the Germans, towards the end of the war, Mannerheim was really close to the French, the British, the Americans. People didn't realize it, that there was a lot of sympathy in the United States for Finland being invaded by the Soviets. Stalin really had to back off because of the American dislike of the Soviet invasion in 1939. But what happened there was, again, Mannerheim, who advocated for being with the Allies and not with Germany at the end of World War I, even though the Germans helped them win their civil war against the Bolsheviks in Finland in 1918. He advocated for the Allies. And at the end of the war, again, towards the end of World War II, Finland switched sides, joined the Allies, betrayed Germany, right? And switched sides. They were allowed. They were given a special permission. The only Axis country not to be occupied by the Allies, by the way, in World War II, Finland. Very interesting, because just like Franco, Finland only would have joined that side because they were being pressed by the communists. and they had no choice. But their real sympathies of that country, being a democracy, laid with the West. And this is an important side note.
Yeah, there's so many examples that tell us so much. I mean, you had Czechoslovakia. In the immediate post-war years, the National Front combined multiple parties under a coalition that barred those deemed reactionary. Communists took key ministries, especially the interior, giving them control of police and security. Propaganda stressed anti-fascism and reconstruction. In February of 1948, a constitutional crisis was used to force non-communist ministers to resign. Mass demonstrations and militias provided pressure. President Benesch, same last name as myself, capitulated, and communist leader Clement Gottwald announced a new order. What followed were show trials, like Rudolf Slansky and others, purges, and the standardization of a one-party state. So this is something that's probably kind of the playbook that the Russians now have for Germany today.
Czechoslovakia in 1948.
Yeah, this is kind of the playbook that they want for us now, for the Germans right now, because the Russians believe they have a lot of control over the AfD party here, the very, very right-wing party. Mm-hmm. The Russians think they control it. And there's also a new left-wing party which gained momentum. And this left-wing party, had this female leader who is just seems to always be loyal to Moscow one way or another.
And the AfD has a female leader, right?
Yeah, they also have a female leader, of course.
Interesting. Who lived in China?
Yeah, for a while, and she's a lesbian, and she doesn't live in Germany actually in a private time. And
how bizarre!
Yeah, and so it's like, and that's not the end of it, because there's an older left wing party that is still struggling with its position towards Moscow, and then there's the mainline parties. The Social Democrats, the SPD, had always had a big heart for Moscow. Still buying gas from the Putin regime, playing nice with the Putin regime for such a long time, wanting to buy more gas, and then of course you have the big defectors. I think was it Golitsyn or the other one of the others. He was very specific about the Social Democrats here and social democratic parties in other countries in Europe, saying, well, Moscow pretty much controls them. And then you have the mainline conservative party. The mainline conservatives, they're mostly pro-America, pro-US, and pro-Britain. But there were some pro-Russian tendencies for a while. So in the minds of the Russian planners, they would use this template. They would create more problems here in Germany. They would just infiltrate more and more different groups, cause chaos, then form a new coalition government, a new People's Front government consisting of different parties, but they're all controlled by the Russians. And then they get into these specific ministries, and then they purge everybody who's not really, anybody who's not really with Russia. And then they have a dictatorship, and then they call it whatever they want to call it, and they have a police state, a total terror state, and then they can do whatever they want with it. It doesn't matter.
And have their one-party authoritarian system.
They can bring Chinese people here. They can bring people from Kazakhstan
here.
They can bring,
wouldn't they?
They can bring anybody who's an engineer or anybody who has technical expertise. They can remove them from Germany and fly them to Russia, and bring people from Kazakhstan to Germany. They can do whatever they want when they have a police state. So this is kind of...
Now, let me ask you something. Now, we've talked about all the secret societies and the groups, and then, of course, this idea of the authoritarian state. And you have the Nazis coming out of the Thule Society, right there in Munich there, right? And you have... they have this Eurasianist idea from General Haushofer, and of course Hess, Hitler's friend Hess, and Rudolf Hess. And of course, you have this similar kind of thing emerging out of the Golovin circle in the Yavlinsky circle. I think it's also called out of Moscow, where Dugin emerges. And you've got Eurasianism adopted by the Russian General Staff in the 1990s, Dugin writing these books. You've got it's almost like they're copying from the Thule Society playbook, from the Nazi playbook, and give people what geopolitics or Eurasianism is. It's the idea that there is always a land power and a sea power. This is very apocalyptic because it's in the book of Revelation. The beasts from the sea and the earth. One is coming out of the sea, the other is coming out of the earth, and they represent, obviously, the symbolism. These beasts have crowns and horns, right? They're powers, they're military powers, they're kingdoms, and so on. And of course, Dugin is all about causing the apocalypse, causing the destruction that's going to regenerate the world. And the Nazis had a touch of this too. Of course, you'd see the 1,000-year Reich that's coming out of the Book of Revelation, and of course, you've got notions of the chosen ones. The 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth becomes the 1,000-year Reich, becomes the thing, the communist, perfect final communist world, the utopia at the end of the rainbow. There's all these apocalyptic or
because you kind of need a quasi religion for revolutionaries. I mean, it's just like it is a religion. Just like I said, when Masonry. British Masonry was created, and then they had it as a sister organization to the scientific organization, which was the Royal Society. So you have the Royal Society and you have Masonry. They're somewhat separate, but it all comes full circle because they wanted a cult system or a religious system that would appeal to scientists. And that's why I think Masonry was never too defined. When you go through the ranks, and now we have all the ritual texts, and we know what's the content of that. They do have certain code phrases and specific secret names, right? This is the same that the Greeks had with their cults. There's this one god that had 3 heads, and only the very, very select elite were allowed to know the name of that deity. So there was some specific stuff they would tell you in Masonry at later stages, but it was all kept still shrouded in mystery. You were never supposed to. You were always left guessing.
The mumbo jumbo.
Yeah, you were always supposed to be left guessing and still have that sense of continuous mystery because it was supposed to appeal to scientists, and by a larger definition of a scientist, a high-ranking military officer. A high-ranking military officer could also be considered a scientist because a military profession is so complicated and requires years of training. And it requires a high level of smartness and intelligence. So it's
military science.
It's a scientific field in and of itself. And so if you have people that are Masons, a physicist or a military officer or somebody in intelligence or whatever, they become Freemasons, and they all become Freemasons, and you have a special mystique religion for them or a cult for them that appeals to them, or that's more useful when they follow that mystery. And I think that in the same vein, if you want to have revolutionaries in a modern sense or quasi-modern sense, because the Illuminati were subversives, the Illuminati were assets. They had most likely they were assets. They had a mission. They were subverting, and they were adding cult elements to that subversion. It wasn't just bland, we don't like these kings he in France or some other kings, and we don't like the Catholics and we don't like their religion. They needed something bigger. They needed something that was not from this world, that was not just mechanical and, yeah, we're going to overthrow a government here, or we just push back that church here. Because it's not, it probably didn't seem powerful enough. You needed a cult system, a religious cult system for revolutionaries, because
and with the theory of international relations that both the Nazis and now the Russians have glommed onto, that they find very useful, the geopolitics, the Eurasianism. I mentioned that it's not only apocalyptic in terms of it's taken right out of the Revelation with the beasts from the sea and the earth. It also has a historical meaning, which, with a cult of parallelism, has been glommed onto by people like Dugin and, of course, by Rudolf Hess and Hitler. And it's in Mein Kampf, is the idea that this land power versus the naval power goes back in history to ancient Greece, to Sparta, the land power, versus Athens, the naval power, and Rome, the land power, versus Carthage, the naval power. And the naval power is the commercial power. The naval power is the democracy, like in Athens. The naval power is the one that is more towards Epicureanism. And the land power, the Spartans are Spartan, the Romans are stoical. So you have this, and of course Dugin plays this up, and of course Dugin likes to point out that, of course, in the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans defeated the land power, defeated the naval power, right? The land power, Sparta defeated Athens and knocked down their long walls. The land power, Rome, who started the war without even knowing how to build a ship, didn't have a navy at all, defeats the sea power, Carthage, in the Punic Wars. And so, of course, but then there's a curiosity. They're going against, the Anglo-Saxon, the English-speaking countries are the sea power. America, Britain with the British naval tradition, America taking over that tradition. All of the English-speaking countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Great Britain, most of them are islands. You could say North America is a super island with Canada and the United States on it. And so it's Oceania, sort of out of 1984, out of Orwell's book. It's the sea power. It's the beast out of the sea. And of course, Dugin then imitates Cato the Elder saying, Carthago delenda est, America is Carthage. Carthage must be destroyed, which you have this in of course, famously pointed out, I'll show the book. This is Heiser's biography of Dugin, and it's got Dugin is saying this. And of course, the title is "The American Empire Should Be Destroyed." This is a quote from Dugin, right? And of course, this is the Eurasianism. But there's a funny thing. We talk about Britain. You talk about the 7 Years' War, World War I, World War II. It is the English powers, the Anglo-American alliance, that wins the world wars, that is prevailing and creating the world order, not really even Russia, though Russia got a lot out of it, got China in the aftermath of the war, got Eastern Europe. It is the people that are calling the tune are the English-speaking countries. The beast out of the sea, for the first time, is not a loser in the 7 Years' War, in the 19th century, in the wars against Napoleon, in World War I and World War II. Beast from the sea is the winner, unlike in the ancient world. And it's very interesting. And you might ask, well, why in the ancient world did the land powers defeat the sea powers? And in the modern world, the sea power defeats the land power in war after war, against Napoleon, against Hitler, against the Kaiser. Why? And there's a very interesting reason why. And it's because in the ancient world, Sparta and Carthage had systems of checks and balances. Sparta actually, the founder of the Spartan Constitution was credited in the ancient world with inventing the system of checks and balances, where Sparta had its popular assembly, its senate, and had two kings, each with a veto over the other. And the Roman Constitution imitated it. They didn't like the name of king, so they had two consuls. They could cancel each other out. They did not like centralized power. The Romans had their tribunes with their veto in the Senate. You had the popular assemblies in Rome. So you had this a very much mixed constitutional systems, which of course this is why the land power won. All things being equal, yeah, the stoical people, even though they don't know how to build ships as good as the sea people, are going to prevail because they had the system of checks and balances. They weren't corrupt, right? They didn't suffer the corruption. And so you have in the modern world, Britain and America, the sea power, had stronger systems of checks and balances. And when you look at Napoleon, you look at the Kaiser, you look then at especially at Nazi Germany and Russia, they didn't have the strong system of checks and balances. And this led to corruption and inefficiency, and they could not economically compete because the corruption factor. They couldn't win.
Yeah, and it's like,
this is why what Russia and China's up against right now. They have this centralized power. How are they going to beat countries that have genuine checks and balances?
Yeah, and it's like in the ancient world, and even afterwards, the empires that came and went. There was a very small number of positions that were just very pleasant, that were awesome, or at least as good as you could have it at the time, because the total amount of value that could be created by an empire was severely limited. The base for everything was food production. Because you could store the grain, you could feed people with the grain, you could move it around, and this was money. This would pay for the army. This would pay for the luxury. This would pay for the protection of the empire. It would pay for everything.
And an army marches on its stomach, as Napoleon famously said.
Yeah, and so then this is very much unlike the situations that we had with empires, when the Royal Society for Science became modernized, or you had the production or the inventions in the 1800s and then the 1900s. This is when a lot more value could be created, useful things could be built. Even in medicine, things that would change people's lives, and a lot more value could be created, not just grain. So back in the day, in the ancient world, or medieval times, this was kind of the biggest. If you were in a position of luxury, you were the chosen one. You could have things that nobody else could have. And so the idea of subverting another system and taking it over and taking the spoils, getting their land, getting that money, getting their gold, getting their women, that appeal was so massive. And still, even if you were successful at that game and you had that rush, you destroy an enemy, you create a new piece of your empire, you have that power of destruction and the power of creation, but even then, every king was vulnerable. Every general was vulnerable. You could still be, like this, the big naval hero that was so hailed in these British museums in London. These
Admiral Nelson.
Yeah, Horatio Nelson. He had one of the greatest victories ever in recorded history, and then he gets hit by one bullet.
Trafalgar.
Yeah. Battle of Trafalgar. He gets killed by one bullet, and even, kings could get sick. The children could have deformities or get sick, or everybody was vulnerable. And I think that even when you were the chosen one and you had the luxury and you had what nobody else had, and I think that created that cult system, because a cult system would promise you directly or indirectly, would promise you more. It would promise you protection from the usual boundaries of life and death, and just so you could have more than just temporary fun and enjoyment of the spoils and the luxury. There would be more, not just
there's
a
another
king's reign.
angle here. that I want to touch on, and it comes up in MAGA, and it comes up in with Duginism and the attempted dark enlightenment influence of the right in the United States, and maybe it applies to the AfD in Germany. It's these Machiavellian, the dark enlightenment, Nick Land, Curtis Yarvin, they've sort of grabbed hold of this Machiavellianism notion. James Burnham, who was with National Review and was sort of a teacher of William F. Buckley. Burnham wrote a book called, famously, The Machiavellians, which became a big hit. And he said, look, it's truth in politics. Machiavelli was telling the truth. We need to be honest about politics. It's a dirty thing, but we got to tell the truth. But the interesting thing about Yarvin and Nick Land and these cynics of the Dark Enlightenment, who are against the Constitution, by the way, they're against checks and balances openly, is that Machiavelli wasn't against checks and balances. He wanted a republic for Italy. And if you read the discourses of Machiavelli wrote a book about republics, which is the discourses on the first 10 books of Livy. And he wrote, of course, The Prince, which is about monarchies. And everybody, is big on The Prince, which is a much thinner book. But if you read Machiavelli, these Machiavellians, so-called, they don't even really know Machiavelli, it seems to me. They're preaching anti-constitutionalism. Machiavelli, in the discourses, says, look, if you want a strong military power, if you want to be the strongest, you got to be a republic. You've got to have checks and balances. Monarchies, principalities is a power, but it's a weaker power. Why? He says, well, principalities, they can make immediate decisions. They can move real fast on things, but the depth of their power is not great. Why? Because they don't have the people with them. They don't have the depth of the whole society. A republic, though it is slow to mobilize, slow to figure out what's going on because they're busy debating, right? And they're checking and balancing each other. And he's pointing to Roman Republican history. And of course, he's also feeding off of Polybius, who wrote, his history, which was the history of the rise of the Roman Empire. And Polybius makes this very important point. I think it is the most famous part of Polybius is his discussion of the Roman constitution of checks and balances. And he said, this is why the Romans are taking over the Mediterranean, why nobody can stop them, because Carthage was further along towards degeneration, right? They were an older republic. Carthage was a republic too, but it was older. It was more degenerate. It couldn't stand up. They were more, hedonistic. They couldn't stand up to Rome in the end. And he said the Greeks couldn't because they had fallen into hedonism. He writes, suddenly there was a dearth of children in Greece. And he said, King Philip of Macedon could not stand up to them. He was a king, too thin support. Antiochus the Great couldn't stand up to them. So the kings and the other systems, they weren't as strong. And he said the Romans were honest. They were honest because, their whole life had this checks and balances. They believed in taking oaths to the gods where they'd be severely punished if they broke an oath, if they acted dishonorably. The Romans were still moral. Polybius says that a Roman general could be entrusted with enormous sums and not a penny would be missing. You entrust a Greek general to raise an army and the whole thing would be plundered and the army couldn't be paid. And he said that's why Greece fell to the Romans. And that the whole world was that way. And you look today and it's critical. It's like they're trying to insinuate this cynical, there's an amoral or immoralness in this dark enlightenment saying, oh, we don't need checks and balances. We don't really need the honesty. We need to admit this sort of dark version of Machiavelli that's not really a balanced understanding of Machiavelli. And yet you look at the total cynical Machiavellianism of Putin and the Russian system or the Chinese system, just the murderous gang, massive corruption. They make a new missile system. Its third stage doesn't work. They make all these tanks and vehicles and they're all made wrong. The Chinese have a tank that when it fires, it floods the smoke from the shell into the tank so that the tank crew gets asphyxiated. I mean, they're always screwing up. They build an aircraft carrier that starts to split apart when it goes to sea. It's this massive corruption because to get an honest day's work out of somebody, you have to have honest leaders who exemplify that to the workers who do an honest day's work. You have to have this. Obviously, the West is been weakened by corruption and stuff. It's nothing compared to Russia, nothing compared to the corruption in China. And again, it goes back to these, where do you get your morality from?
Yeah, and so what is a proper reaction to, especially in a legal sense? What is a proper reaction to, for example, subversive networks, subversive organizations that use the groups that use the banner of anti-fascism to create with the intent to create a communist police state, and just to do the program
or at least
that we just described.
Column inside of the United States and other countries, a communist-controlled fifth column that allegedly is on the right.
Because over time, more and more people and different kinds of experts, they realize, okay, this is kind of the communist, for example, this is the communist playbook, or was the National Socialist playbook. This is how it's done. This is how they want to get to their goal, and they can have all kinds of different types of marketing. Now, here's one example. This is
Alex,
West.
I gotta go, so we need to wrap up.
Okay, so people can see that on candorintel.com. It goes into West Germany's 1956 ban of the KPD, Communist Party. This is possible, very, very much possible in this country. So you can ban a party if you can prove it follows a Marxist, Leninist, follows these principles, because there's only one way this could go with them. So you can ban a party. The United States has kind of in essence the same approach, but it's a different legal procedure. They go after crimes specifically, and they don't really want to ban parties, and they don't want to ban speech. You can ban more speech here in Germany, but in essence, there's a legal system to deal with this subversion, even though it may call itself anti-fascism.
Well, I gotta go. Thank you very much for this, for being with us today. This has been an interesting discussion. It just went on. I lost track of time. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeff Nyquist. My co-host has been Alex Benesch. This is another edition of Friends and Enemies.